I have the microphone now, you have to believe everything I say. Yeah, thanks for that, Nicole. My name is David, for those of you I've met, and I'm here to tell you about the vibrator, myths and Phallus-ies. That being said, though, I just want to start off and get something out of the way. I realize this is a geek of the topic, right? So this is what we're talking about, right? Talking about vibrators. And I just wanted to start with a slide just up on vibrators, so we can all collectively have a nice giggle, and then we can move on like mature adults. Okay, you ready? So vibrators, right? The rabbit, right? They can be multiple colors and multiple textures, different sizes. There's like a dragon wing or something in the background. They can on your finger. They're different shapes. It's got a vacuum on it. Very discreet. Very not discreet. Goes on your finger again. Very discreet. Perfect size, ladies. Perfect size. Okay. Very intimidating. 2 heads. I don't know if you do that one. Angle matters, apparently. Above my pay grade. Moving on. So, like Nicole says, I have no reason to be speaking to you about this, really. So why am I speaking to you about it? It's because on basically our first date in 2017, she goes, we're going to go to this place called Good Vibrations. And I was like, okay, cool, what's that? And obviously it's a sex shop. Didn't realize that at the time. The point is, you go to the sex shop, and in the back corner of the sex shop is this little room. And in that room is the Antique Vibrator Museum. If you're in San Francisco, go check it out. But this room is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a bunch of old historical vibrators and examples of them through time and why they look like that and sort of how they developed over time. So that's how this knowledge got stuck in my brain, and I need to now pass it on to all of you so that you also have it stuck in your brains. So to go back, so early origins. Sex toys date back as far as the Neolithic area, so 28,000 years BCE. So humans have been creative and horny from the dawn of time, right? So there's a stone chalk phallus that you use as a sex toy found in Germany. So there's archaeological evidence of sex toys dating back. But I'll add a caveat, we're not talking about just sex toys in general tonight, we're just talking specifically about vibrators. So we're gonna move past that and jump to ancient Egypt. And Cleopatra. So Cleopatra lived around, I could probably just get that by without that. Cleopatra was 69 to 30 BCE, and she's painted throughout history as quite an insatiable woman. So then there's this legend around her that she invented the world's first vibrator. And what she did is she took a gourd and hollowed it out and then filled it with angry bees and put a top on it, right? So, and then the vibrating of these angry bees inside inside of the gourd created the world's first vibrator. I will just add, there's no archaeological evidence for this, so take it with a grain of salt. From like a physical, mechanical standpoint, I'm not convinced it would work. I wouldn't recommend trying it at home. But if you do, tell us about it and do a Nerd Night talk. So, allegedly, world's first vibrator. From there, we're going to jump to 1800s Europe, and we find Europe in the throes of a pandemic. Now, this pandemic affects mostly women. So if you were childless or had children, if you menstruate regularly, widowed, or generally women who are eager to have intercourse but were now deprived of this. If you were any of those women, you were at risk. Common symptoms included anxiety, shortness of breath, fainting, nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, heaviness in the abdomen, sexual desire or loss of appetite for sex, sexually forward behavior, or a general tendency to cause trouble for others, right? So if you were any one of those women, you had any one of those symptoms, you very likely had hysteria. So hysteria was a medical condition, and it comes from this Greek word for uterus. The first known medically documented record of this comes from, again, ancient Egypt, 1900 BCE. So it's been around for a long time. Some well-known ancient Greeks did a lot of thinking about this. So we're talking about Plato and Hippocrates, like people we know and sort of somewhere in our brains respect. They attributed hysteria to a wandering womb, and this idea that your uterus would just pick up and move around a woman's body, and it put a lot of pressure on other organs, just caused all kinds of trouble, right? This was the best thinking of the day. And thinking didn't get much better by the Renaissance period, so this is 14th to 17th centuries. Now we're talking about demonic possession, but someone does have the bright idea, oh, maybe women are acting funny because of sex, and somehow linked to sex. I don't know how, but maybe it is. So we'll come back to that. So hysteria remains a problematic diagnosis in valid medical diagnosis until the 1950s. So that's 1900 BCE to 1950 CE. So that's around 4,000 years. This is a valid medical diagnosis. And over time, it's grown into more and more of a catch-all diagnosis for women. So at some point in the 19th century, a physician tried to write down every sort of known documented symptom of hysteria. And when he got to 75 pages long, he stopped and gave up because there were too many symptoms. So really just anything that any woman did was a symptom of hysteria. So you can see it's getting very problematic, right? And so hysteria is history's clearest example of how the male-dominated medical establishment has systematically misdiagnosed women and continues to do so. And it was especially problematic because even as doctors learned more and knew better, and they realized a woman's uterus didn't just pick up and move whenever it wanted, and they realized it stayed put, And so the diagnosis shifted away from the uterus doing something. The treatment options still remained associated with uterus or female sexual organs. So that meant if you had this catch-all diagnosis of hysteria because you were acting funny, some male doctor looked at you and said, you need something done to your uterus. And that persisted for a really, really long time. So speaking of treatment options, I guess, over time, from 1800s Europe, let's say, what was the cure that women who were diagnosed with hysteria given? What were their options? If you were a married woman, you were in luck. You were told to go home and have sex with your husband. And that was supposed to cure you. At some points in time, in various cultures and various medical practices, male semen was thought to have healing properties. So bonus there if you can get some of that good stuff. If you were an unmarried or widowed woman and therefore had no chance of having sex with any man, it was socially taboo, a midwife would massage your genital areas with a scented oil, and that was thought to alleviate some of your pressures and make the hysteria go back down for a while. In somewhat extreme and problematic cases, surgical hysterectomies were performed on women. So that's the partial or complete removal of sexual organs, your cervix, uterus, fallopian tubes, ovaries, any of the supporting organs or structures. So again, a catch-all diagnosis for any number of conditions or symptoms. And these are the lengths to which male physicians and medicine at the time are going. So really problematic for women. But let's focus in on this, pelvic massage technique. That sounds good, right? So the point of this was stimulating female genitals to a state of hysterical paroxysm. Paroxysm is a sudden inducement or attack of emotion or activity. So we are stimulating women's genitals until they suddenly are very emotional and active, right? So, we all are thinking something. But, male physicians at the time, this wasn't sexual at all to them. This was a very valid medical procedure that they undertook with, very, I'm doing this for medicine, right? I'll do this. But they hated it. They got hand cramps and arm cramps, and they had to wear braces. They just didn't like doing it. It was such a tedious, laborious chore, right? And, look at his face. He's like, oh, dude, this is my 13th of the day. Don't want to be here, right? No record of what the woman thought. But the point is, so male physicians didn't like doing this, and over time they thought, oh, we need to do something to make this better for us and for the patients. But for us, how do we make this easier? And so around mid-1800s, you start to see improvements in this procedure. So this is called the pelvic douche, and it was popular in the Americas and Europe at the time. And it's exactly what it looks like, right? A woman sits there and you just shoot a high-powered jet of water at her genitals. And this was thought to improve the procedure, although I'm not sure if that's, again, if it's for the patient or for the person administering, but it's improving the procedure, right? So carry forward this idea of innovation and making the procedure better. This is 1800s, so we're talking about industrial revolution. There are new power sources, get steam motors, eventually get electricity as it starts to spread into businesses and homes. And physicians are thinking we need to get in on this, like done with hand cramps. We need something new. So the first sort of iteration of this, you get hand cranked vibrators. So doing the same thing, this is an 1800s grade rubber tip, and as you crank the handle, this thing starts to oscillate and vibrate back and forth. So that starts to do the same thing. In the 1860s, you get what is technically the first medical grade vibrator, and it's called the manipulator. And it's a large padded table with a hole cut out in the middle, and then you put this metal orb in the middle, and it's attached to a giant steam-powered motor, and the orb vibrates. So you get a patient to come up and sit on the table, and they sort of situate their genitals against the orb, and away it goes. And that was the new technique. And so steam power became the new thing in hysterical paroxysm. This is called the Chattanooga, so I'm assuming it's American. It was over 2 meters tall, and it required an entirely separate room for its coal-powered steam engine. And then just this little vibrating tip of it would sort of poke through this little glory hole in the wall where the patient was, and then the patient, that was the treatment room. So these are the lengths that people are going to alleviate doctors of having to do that. But then carry forward this spirit of innovation again, it takes us to 1880s Britain. And that's where we meet Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville. And he invents the percuteur, and it is considered the world's first electromechanical vibrator. So technically what we now think of as a vibrator is an electromechanical vibrator. So this is the first iteration of what we would think of as a vibrator, the 1880s. It's a big deal. So you can imagine sort of over here on point D is the vibrating tip. This was sort of handheld, I guess, and then it connected to what was a large 40-pound battery. But technically, that meant it was portable, right? So this doctor wasn't tied to his office. He could go around and do house calls for these hysterical paroxysms, right? So it's a great business model, really. And then on the right, you see some of the tips that would go over here on the vibrating node. So I don't know, imagine Victorian era material choices and then pick whatever shape you want to put by your genitals. That's for you. Away you go. So this moment in history and in medical history and sexual history, however you want to think of it, it sort of has really caught the public imagination, where we invented the first vibrators. They're so great. And it's portrayed on stage. So there's a play called In the Next Room, and then in parentheses, or the Vibrator Play, because that's how everyone's going to remember it. But it's about this doctor inventing a vibrator because his hand was too tired to keep masturbating women, right? There's also a film about it called Hysteria. Delightful. I did it as research for this talk. It's pretty fun. It's got some ridiculous moments, like, about the first time they ever used a vibrator on a woman and they have goggles on it. Would recommend if you have a chance. But so this story, it's the most common explanation of how the vibrator came to be. And it's a great story, right? It's sexy, it's naughty, it's like doctor-patient porn, but you can almost kind of get away with talking about it in a historical sense, the dinner table, depending on the dinner table, or you can get asked to speak about it in a bar and it's okay. It's a great story, and it almost has feminist undertones even, right? Because these women who are sexually unsatisfied by their partners, their male partners who can't do this for them, then the husbands will pay to send their wives to doctors who will then massage them to orgasm. Like, that's a great feminist narrative, right? So people love this story. But where did it come from? So in 1999, this woman, Rachel Maines, writes this book, and it's called The Technology of Orgasm. Rachel Maines is an American historical technology scholar, which means she looks at how different cultures and societies used to do things, and then she looks at the tools that they use to do that. So she put together this book, and I mean, so it has this great story, right? And it's filled with great lines, like, doctors inherited the job of producing orgasm in women because it was a job nobody else wanted. The vibrator inherited the job when they got tired of it too. So great book, right? Great read. The problem is that in the 20 years since the book has come out, other academics have started poking and prodding at the book and fact-checking some of the sources, and it doesn't stand up, unfortunately, to academic rigor. And especially when you start looking at how vibrators, which were a thing, but how vibrators were actually used in medical practice and what they were using them to treat, you don't find it as a female hysteria treatment. You find it on treating pain, headaches, irritability, indigestion, and constipation, and especially in men. So kind of getting away. So let's go back really quick and do a fact check of what we've talked about. So the idea that the vibrator was invented by Dr. Granville, British physician, 1880s. That is true. Dr. Granville was a real British physician, really wrote a book about nerve vibration and using it as a treatment in his medical practice, and he really did invent the perpetuer, which was that. So that's real. That happened in 1880, genuinely the first electromechanical vibrator. The next part of the story is that vibrators were used to treat female hysteria, right? This is not true, unfortunately. Granville actually argued specifically against using vibrators to treat female hysteria. He only thought that they should be used on men. So this was actually a male patient, and it was used to treat things that, like, we nowadays would say, oh, I need a massager for this, right? So it was muscular pains, skeletal aches, things like that. Various, like, lung disease, I think they thought could be treated by vibrators, and then also impotence, which I think is what's happening in this picture. I don't know where it's going. And then the last one is this idea that Victorian doctors just didn't know anything about female sexuality or anatomy, and they were en masse sort of naively massaging women to orgasm and not realizing what they were doing, right? So again, also false. Victorian doctors knew exactly what they were doing. They knew about female anatomy and what the clitoris was and how, this is an orgasm. It wasn't just, oh, okay, we call it a hysterical paroxysm. We're good. That's a medical procedure. So this idea, this story painted by Maines doesn't really hold up. So how then, because vibrators still had to get from a doctor's office to, nowadays our bedstands, our nightstands, right? So how does it get from there to there? And basically, in the early 1900s, vibrators are seen as quite a legitimate medical device, and they start being sold directly to consumers in like mail order catalogs. And they're sold as cure-alls, basically. You can get rid of your muscular aches, your skeletal aches. They'll get rid of wrinkles for you. They'll even get rid of tuberculosis, right? So anything. And they were sold to men and women. It's not just a women thing. So they start coming directly into the home. You don't have to go to the doctor's office every time for $3 a visit. You just get one from Sears Roebuck for $5. You're home and away. And they were so prevalent in these times that it's actually considered the fifth electrical appliance to enter the home. So it went tea kettle, sewing machine, fan, toaster, and then the vibrator. So if you had those five, that was considered the modern perfect home at the time. So everyone needs a vibrator, is the moral of that story. So how do we get from that point to more of the modern vibrator and our connotations with it? Well, in the 1910s, the American Medical Association speaks out and they go, no, vibrators, not like real medical devices. They don't do anything. It's snake oil. Stop buying them. Don't do it. And then a key point is that in the 1920s, porn industry realized, hey, these are pretty great, right? And so they start appearing in porn films. And so a combination of those two, suddenly vibrators disappear from medical offices. Doctors stop treating hysteria or any other symptoms with vibrators. And they sort of disappear from polite social conversation. You can't really talk about a vibrator anymore, because that's for porn. But they're still sold in mail order catalogs. I think just the ads sort of change in their tone, because before it was very nice, professional Victorian era women, and it was on their face and it was on her arm or whatever. Now it's a woman. You can't really tell if she's wearing a top or something. It's up by her face, and then the wording is, it's give it to her, away she goes, as penetrating comfort. Stimulate circulation too. So they get more coy and suggestive in the adverts, and so there is sort of a unspoken cultural shift about it. And that kind of takes us just into the modern era, basically. By the 1960s, you could find what we would think of as a vibrator in a sex shop. You could buy it in a sex shop. In the 1970s, radical feminism begins to spread and grow, and women are reclaiming what is their sexuality, essentially, which has been repressed for so long through a lot of society. And so in the 70s, there was quite a significant social survey done in the US, and it found that 1% of women had ever used a vibrator. So then fast forward to the 1990s, they're becoming more and more spoken about, to the point that there's a whole episode about them in Sex and the City that I watched for research for this talk. Didn't know about it before. But so it's becoming more and more like blasé. You can talk about it and get away with it, right? And then by 2009, up to 50% of women surveyed say they've used a vibrator before. So a 50 times increase in the number over 40 years. That basically brings us to today and the end of my talk, but I'm just going to leave you for your viewing pleasure with all of the pictures of antique vibrators I found in the research for this, but didn't have an excuse to put them anywhere in my talk. And while this is playing, it's not quite an Aurora, but I'm going to let it play. And feel free to ask any questions in the meantime. Or just giggle, whatever you want. Anything. Yeah. No, it was originally I was going to call it Good Vibrations and an homage to the sex shop, and then I realized that it was more about unpacking misconceptions around it, and then I was like, oh, like myths and fallacies. Phallus-ies. Yeah, it was an afterthought. Yeah.
At what point was the rabbit introduced?
The
Rabbit.
1970s, I want to say. Yeah. Or 80s. No, sorry. 1970s was the magic wand, which I showed as the not discrete one at the beginning. Rabbit was the 80s. Anyone? So vibrators were developed in a genuine medical context, but not to vibrate women to cure their hysteria. So it was developed for men, and then over time, it was sort of like, oh, women can use this too. And then it was, oh, women can use this for something else. But so yeah, the main, most accepted, most repeated narrative is that the doctors got tired of using their hands, and so they've invented a vibrator to do specifically that. It's not quite that direct, I guess. That's an 8. All right.